Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we are doing just that, plunging into a story that, well, it's dominated headlines for years now. We're talking about Vijay Mallya.
Right. A name that for many people, it just brings up images of, debt, default, being called a fugitive.
That public narrative is certainly powerful, yeah. But our source material for this deep dive, it gives us a pretty rare chance to look beyond those headlines.
Exactly. We're drawing insights from excerpts of a recent, quite extensive interview. Seems like it was his first in about 9 years, where he actually gets to present his side of this, incredibly complex story.
And look, our mission here isn't to decide who's right or wrong. It's really about using this specific source to unpack his perspective, understand the claims he's making, and see how they sort of stack up against the widely reported narrative you've probably heard.
Yeah, get ready for maybe some surprising details, maybe a few aha moments as we explore this.
Absolutely. So let's start, like any good story, right at the beginning. Who was Vijay Mallya before Kingfisher Airlines became, the main story?
Well, from his account in the interview, he was born in Kolkata, moved around a bit. He describes his upbringing under his father as pretty strict.
Okay.
He talks about key lessons like the importance of hard work, understanding a balance sheet inside out, and his father's belief that education was the only real lasting legacy. He even mentions his father telling him, there may not be any shoes to step into, which sounds like a nod to the socialist policies back then, maybe limiting inherited wealth.
Interesting. And his mother?
Her lessons were different, apparently more focused on thinking positively, not wasting time arguing.
So then he finds himself in charge of the UB group really young.
Remarkably young, yeah, 28. His father passed away unexpectedly. And he talks about the challenge, having to immediately deal with these experienced long-term stalwarts in the company, basically having to prove himself from day one.
Makes sense. And his early interest was marketing.
Yeah, seems like it started during his training and time in the U.S. and one of his first big moves as chairman, asking his father for 10 lakhs, that's 1,000,000 rupees, to market Kingfisher beer.
Kingfisher beer. Wasn't that an old brand?
Exactly, from way back in 1857. Apparently it was pretty much dormant, but he saw potential there.
And that marketing focus led to some creative solutions, right? Given the restrictions.
Definitely. He talks about getting around India's ban on alcohol advertising by building these successful surrogate businesses, Kingfisher water, Kingfisher music cassettes.
Ah, right. I remember those.
And using events heavily sport, fashion, music, just to keep the brand name visible.
So this is where that public image starts forming, the flamboyance, the showman stuff.
That's what he suggests. Malaya's take is that this was largely a media creation, something cooked up to sell news. He says he was just living like any other wealthy 28-year-old, enjoying cars, parties, music, sports. But he insists, and this is key to his account, that he was using his own money from his business earnings, not borrowed funds.
And that famous phrase, king of good times. Where did that come from, according to him?
This is pretty interesting, actually. He claims it didn't start as some personal motto or title he gave himself. It was literally the label printed on the Kingfisher beer bottle.
No way. Really?
That's what he says. And the media just sort of ran with it and attached it to him personally.
Huh. And he claims he didn't pay much attention to it at the time.
Yeah, he says he basically ignored the negative press and that flamboyant tag because he was just too busy running the business, traveling, living what he felt was a transparent life.
Okay, so let's shift gears then. From the man and his image to the venture that, became the real center of the storm, Kingfisher Airlines.
Right. And the origin story, according to him, it's not what a lot of people think.
How so?
He says it didn't come from some sudden personal idea or, that common story about it being a birthday gift for his son. He calls that complete baloney.
Right.
He says the idea actually came from a presentation by the Damana brothers, and the airline launched in May 2005.
And was it professional from the start? Or just his pet project?
He really emphasizes that before they even launched, they hired a property management team, including a CEO brought in from the U.S. He frames it as a serious, structured operation from the get-go.
And the vision, what was the goal?
Ambitious, definitely. To create the absolute best premium flying experience in India. Really focused on passenger comfort, safety, and connecting new places, sometimes places that didn't have great air links before.
And he was involved in the details.
Sounds like it, yeah. He paints this picture of being incredibly hands-on, claims he personally monitored on-time performance via SMS every single night,
Wow.
and obsessed over little things like making sure glasses were clean just right for business class, calling customers guests, not passengers, that kind of detail.
Okay. Then came the big move, acquiring Air Deccan. That was controversial, wasn't it?
Hugely controversial. His stated logic, though, in this interview,
What does he say?
he frames it as industry consolidation, basically buying a competitor. He points to Air Deccan's super low fares, remember the 1 rupee tickets. He felt that was distorting what people expected to pay for flights.
Okay, market disruption.
And also, he mentions the aircraft commonality. Both airlines used Airbus planes and pilots. He saw potential for efficiency there after they merged.
But wasn't the common thinking that it was just a shortcut to
Well,
get around that 5-year rule for flying internationally?
he addresses that head on, calls it complete nonsense, says that wasn't the primary driver.
And after the acquisition, they had the two brands, Kingfisher First and Kingfisher Red, the low-cost one.
Right. And he defends the decision to still offer food and entertainment, even on Kingfisher Red, the low-cost option.
Which is unusual for low cost, yeah.
Exactly. His reasoning, he says, was that he believed Indian travelers really valued food and entertainment, and this would differentiate them even in that budget segment.
Okay, so despite this vision, the strategies, the airline eventually failed. What does he point to as the cause?
He describes it as a perfect storm that really hit around 2008.
Okay, what were the elements of this storm?
Well, first, the global financial crisis, right? Lehman Brothers collapsing, that hit hard.
Yeah, it impacted everyone.
Then fuel costs just went through the roof. Crude oil spiking from maybe $60 a barrel up to $140. Plus, he mentions this punitive ad valorem state sales tax on aviation fuel in India, which made it even worse.
Ouch, so massive cost pressures.
Huge. And this is where his account gets really interesting and quite contentious. He claims he actually went to the Union finance minister at the time, Pranab Mukherjee,
To do what?
to plead his case, basically saying, look, we need to downsize the airline to survive these pressures.
Makes sense.
But he claims he was told not to downsize.
Wait, the finance minister told him not to shrink the airline. Why?
According to Mallaya's account, the reasons given were about maintaining connectivity across India and preserving jobs. And crucially, he claims he was told the banks would support Kingfisher if they kept operating at scale.
Wow. So he's saying the government advised him against downsizing and promised bank support.
That's his claim. He says, and I think this is almost a direct quote from the source, that is how it all started. He directly links the decision not to downsize then, based on this alleged advice, to the eventual collapse.
It's a very significant claim.
Yeah.
He also mentioned issues getting investment, right?
Yes, foreign investment specifically. He says policy at the time prevented the kind of foreign capital injection he needed to keep the airline afloat.
Did he have a deal lined up?
He claims he did. Says he had an agreement with the CEO of Etihad Airways, James Hogan, for them to invest. But, he says, permission from the Indian government was denied. Denied. And then he points out, sounding pretty frustrated in the transcript, that the same permission was granted for Etihad to invest in Jet Airways just 6 months after Kingfisher finally collapsed.
Oof. Okay, so putting his perspective together, he's blaming this perfect storm, the economy, fuel prices, but also specific government actions or inactions, like blocking investment and allegedly advising against downsizing.
Exactly. That's the picture he paints. He contrasts that environment he faced with India now being, the fastest growing aviation market in the world, which of course leads us right into the financial mess.
Right. The loans, the default, all the allegations that came after.
Okay, so the loans were substantial from a consortium of, I think, 17 banks. He does clarify that Kingfisher Airlines, the company, was the borrower.
But he was personally involved.
Yes, he and UBHL United Breweries Holdings Limited gave personal guarantees. That's important.
And he also put his own company's money in, didn't he?
He makes a big point of this, yeah. Says he feels it's often overlooked. He states he personally infused 3,000 crores, that's 30 billion rupees of the UB Group's own money into Kingfisher to try and keep it flying.
Okay, so not just bank money.
Uh-huh.
But then there was the really difficult issue of employees not getting paid. How does he address that?
He acknowledges it was painful. His explanation is that the company in India simply ran out of cash. But then he adds this surprising detail about why some funds that could have potentially helped were blocked.
What was that mean?
He claims that 260 crores of UB Group's money that wasn't Kingfisher's directly, was frozen by the Karnataka High Court.
Frozen?
By who? By the banks, according to him. The same banks seeking repayment allegedly objected to releasing those UB funds, arguing that the money belonged to them after the default.
So he's saying the banks prevented UB money from potentially going to employees.
That's his assertion. He uses it to argue against the idea that he just decided not to pay staff. He also pushes back on claims he prioritized international staff, saying money was often available from overseas ticket sales for them.
He also faced accusations about his own salary during that time, right?
Yeah, the reports of a 33 crore per year salary while employees weren't paid. He flatly denies this, challenges anyone to show the balance sheets proving it.
And the very tragic story of the employee's wife's suicide.
He addresses it, says he became aware, looked into it. His belief, he states, is that it was primarily linked to a marital issue, but got conveniently blamed on Kingfisher because of the timing and the situation. He does say he accepts blame if people place it on him, given the circumstances, and mentions writing private condolence letters.
Okay, let's talk about the debt itself. Did he try to settle it?
According to his account, yes. He claims he made 4 distinct settlement offers to the banks between 2012 and 2015.
4 offers?
Yeah.
Even before the courts?
He says yes, including offers formally submitted to the Supreme Court, which he claims are on record.
And what happened? Why didn't they settle?
He claims the banks just refused them all. His suggestion is they were perhaps holding out, hoping to recover more later, which, he points out, they eventually did recover a much larger sum.
He mentions a specific instance.
Recounts offering a settlement directly to the SBI chairperson in Hyderabad. And here's another striking claim from the interview. He alleges that a senior SBI official later privately admitted to him that the bank would have settled, but they were afraid of backlash or action from the CBI, the Central Bureau of Investigation.
Wow. Implying political or agency pressure on the bank's decision not to settle.
That seems to be the implication of his claim, yes. So, with these settlement offers apparently rejected, we get to March 2016 and his departure from India.
The fugitive moment in the public eye. What's his version?
It's completely different. He insists it was a pre-scheduled business trip to Geneva. Nothing secret about it.
Pre-scheduled.
That's his claim. And here's another bombshell from his account. He says he personally told the then Union Finance Minister, Arun Jaitley, that he was leaving right before he went to the airport.
He told the finance minister he was leaving? That contradicts everything we heard at the time.
Massively. It's a world away from the narrative of him sneaking off with bags packed. He also denies knowing about any Supreme Court hearing related to his case scheduled for the day after he left, which was widely reported as the trigger for his departure.
So why didn't he just come back then, if it was a normal trip?
His explanation is straightforward. His passport was revoked by the Indian government very shortly after he arrived in the UK.
Okay. So he couldn't travel back even if he wanted to.
That's his position. Plus, he points out he's been a permanent resident of the UK since way back in 1988, which already limited how long he could legally stay in India each year anyway.
So, facing those labels, core, meaning thief, fraud, fugitive, how does he directly respond to those?
His core argument centers on the nature of the case. He keeps stressing, look, this is about money owed, it's a debt recovery issue, it's not about, drug smuggling or violence or other types of crime.
And he uses specific figures to back this up, right? This is where it gets interesting with the numbers.
Exactly. He refers to the official Debt Recovery Tribunal, the DRT certificate, which apparently stated the amount owed was 203 crores, about 62 billion rupees.
Okay, that was the official debt figure from the tribunal.
Right. But then he points to what he says is the Ministry of Finance's own report, acknowledging that the recovery from his assets reached 1,400 to 100 crores, 141 billion rupees.
Wait, hang on. Debt certificate says 6,200 crores owed. Government report says 4,100 crores recovered. That's more than double the original debt amount.
That is precisely his point. And it's the foundation of his argument against being called a core or a willful defaulter. He basically asks, how can I be a thief if the assets pledged mostly his shares, which appreciated over time resulted in the banks recovering more than twice the principal debt determined by the tribunal?
That's quite a discrepancy.
He even says, maybe a bit sarcastically, that he's perhaps the only core who ended up repaying 2.5 times the principal. He's clear that this 1,400 crore figure came from the sale of his assets, mainly those pledged shares, through the official legal processes.
Okay, so beyond the overall debt figure, what about the specific allegations from the agencies, like the CBI and the ED?
He tackles those too. For the CBI, claims things like misrepresenting facts to IDBI Bank or colluding on that 900 crore loan he counters by saying the IDBI loan was fully approved by their board.
Which included government reps.
Yes, he mentions representatives from the Reserve Bank of India and the Finance Ministry were on that board, implying it went through proper channels. He absolutely denies any collusion, says there's not an iota of proof.
What about misusing loan money? The private jet story, for example.
He argues that large sums going overseas were for totally legitimate airline operating costs, leasing planes, buying spare parts, maintenance checks overseas. He estimates about 50% of an airline's costs are normally in foreign currency anyway.
And the brand valuation. Was that inflated?
He denies misrepresenting it, says they use reports from well-known international firms, Grant Thornton and Brand Finance, and that the banks accepted those valuations at the time.
Okay. And the enforcement director at the ED, their focus is often money laundering. They cited a figure around 3,500 crores, right?
Yeah, 357 crores is mentioned. Mallya questions the very definition of laundering in this context. He asks, does it just mean theft? He insists there's zero evidence he siphoned off Kingfisher funds to buy properties overseas.
So what was that money the ED is talking about, according to him?
He claims it's basically the bank borrowings themselves being relabeled or recharacterized by the agency as laundered funds.
So he clearly feels the system itself, the legal process, has been unfair to him.
Very much so. He points out that the UK court's extradition ruling wasn't about guilt or innocence. It was just to decide if there was a prima facie case, enough basic evidence to send him back for trial in India, which they found there was.
And his view on the Indian system.
He expresses a strong view that in India, unlike maybe other places, business failure often gets treated like criminal fraud. He mentions other businessmen who he feels ended up jailed simply because their companies failed.
And he makes some pretty strong claims about how the banks and agencies have behaved since the recovery.
Yeah, this is quite striking. He states, very pointedly in the interview, that despite making 15 requests, the banks involved have still not provided him with a final statement of account showing how the recovered money was applied.
15 requests, no statement.
That's his claim. And here's another point he makes. He asserts that both the DRT's recovery officer and the official liquidator involved in winding up UBHL have actually stated in court proceedings that the banks have been fully paid from the recovered assets.
Wait, court officers saying the banks are fully paid?
According to his account of those proceedings, yes. Yet, he says the banks still haven't submitted the final accounts confirming this. He's apparently filed a petition in the Karnataka High Court trying to force them to provide these statements.
That implies a lack of transparency, at least from his perspective.
Precisely. He uses words like the system being riggable. He clearly believes he's become a convenient political football and a poster boy for the government's anti-corruption drive.
And he cites the Prime Minister mentioning the debt and recovery figures.
Yes, he mentions PM Modi referencing the 9,000 crore, 14,000 crore figures and speeches as evidence that his case has been elevated to a high political level.
He even touches on past dealings with politicians, doesn't he?
Briefly, yes. Recalls politicians asking for election favors, things like cash, copious amounts of alcohol, vehicles for campaigning. He sort of leaves the implication of under-the-table dealing hanging, saying he's not going to confirm or deny that.
And he contrasts his situation with Air India.
Yeah, he questions why the intense focus and pursuit was almost solely on Kingfisher's debt, when historically, entities like Air India had faced much larger arrears without the same kind of punitive action, in his view.
So, after all this time, the legal fights, the public image, what's life like for him now, according to this interview?
He describes it as sort of semi-retired, living in the UK, spends time with his dogs, works on his classic cars, seems that's a real passion, and he says he still runs his overseas businesses, which are mostly in the alcohol sector.
But the legal stuff must take up a lot of time and money.
He acknowledges that, yes. A significant amount of his time and resources go into the legal battles, defending himself against the ongoing efforts from India and related cases in the UK courts. He says his existing overseas businesses are funding these costs.
Does he feel constrained?
He does mention feeling restricted, being basically stuck in one country for 9 years because his passport was revoked. He contrasts it sharply with his previous life of constant global travel, calls it a game changer for his lifestyle.
But he downplays it slightly.
Yeah, he adds, it's not a matter of life and death, framing it more pragmatically.
And how does he deal with the continued negative press and public perception? Does it get to him?
He claims it bothers his mother more, she's 98 apparently, and gets upset by Indian media reports. He says he's developed a thicker skin, tries to ignore it mostly.
Does he think the media has it in for him?
He speculates a bit, yeah. Suggests maybe part of the media's negativity is because he doesn't break down or get visibly upset in front of them, doesn't weep, as he puts it, which he thinks they'd love to capture.
She denies it's just a tough facade.
Yeah, denies it's a defense mechanism. Claims his apparent toughness is genuine, just built up from years of facing difficult situations.
Looking back, any regrets expressed in the interview?
Not many sweeping regrets, but he does mention two specific maybes.
Okay.
One, maybe he shouldn't have started Kingfisher Airlines in the first place. And two, maybe he should have ignored the alleged advice from the finance minister and just gone ahead and downsized the airline when he first thought it was necessary.
He thinks downsizing might have saved it.
He suggests it might have, yes. Believes that could have been a turning point.
He also pushes back on the idea that his lifestyle was funded by the airline's debt.
Right, strongly. He counters the idea he had extreme wealth from borrowed money, points out his assets in India have been seized. He argues his high public profile and the perception of wealth came from aggressive, effective marketing for his brands.
Like the Kingfisher calendar, the
Yeah.
sponsorships.
Exactly. Things designed to boost the brands, he claims, not evidence of him personally dipping into borrowed funds for his lifestyle.
So he sticks to the line that the flamboyant image was marketing, not debt-fueled reality.
That's his consistent view in the source material. Reiterates he never really tried to manage his public image, feels the media constructed that flamboyant personality because it sold news.
And the big question, would he ever return to India?
He says he would consider it, yes, but only if he felt assured he would get a fair trial.
But he doesn't feel confident about that.
Based on his comments about his experiences with the agencies and the legal system so far, he suggests that track record doesn't exactly inspire confidence that a fair trial is guaranteed.
So finally, how does he want people to remember him? Putting aside all the controversy.
Simply, he hopes people will remember the good things he did during his long business career, not just the Kingfisher failure, and definitely not as a churro, a thief.
Yeah, so there you have it. A deep dive into Vijay Mallya's side of the story, pulling directly from his claims and perspective in that recent, rare interview.
Yeah, and it's certainly filled with contrasts to the prevailing narrative, isn't it? His version of the airline's origin, the Air Deccan deal, those really significant claims about government interactions on downsizing and foreign investment.
And his detailed rebuttals on the financial front, the loan situation, the non-payment of employees, those alleged settlement offers, his explanation for leaving India, and especially that stark difference he highlights between the official debt figure and the recovered amount.
It really underscores the importance, doesn't it, in these incredibly complex, high-profile cases. You have to look at multiple perspectives, even the uncomfortable ones, to get anywhere near a full picture. You need to hear the claims directly from the source.
Absolutely. And this isn't just some distant story about high finance and a public figure you might read about. It touches on bigger themes that affect many areas.
Like business risk, the harsh realities of business failure, the sheer power of public perception, and how media shapes narratives, and yeah, the sometimes confusing or opaque ways legal and political systems can work.
So, as you, our listener, process all this, here's maybe a final thought to chew on. Given this complex tangle of claims and counterclaims we've unpacked, and particularly that point about assets being recovered that far exceed the principal debt claimed by the tribunal, what does the whole Vijay Mallya saga reveal about the complex interplay between business failure, the stories we tell about it, and how justice is pursued when things go wrong in such a highly public, highly scrutinized way?
A lot to think about. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.